Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How prevalent are nuclear weapons around the world? What type of danger do they pose to people in the United States as well as all the other countries of the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and my guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Jonathan Granoff. Mr. Jonathan Granoff is the president of the Global Security Institute. He also serves as the co-chair of the Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association. Jonathan Granoff, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start at the top. We'll get into the issue in a few moments, but what is the Global Security Institute? When was it started? Why was it started?
Well, it arose out of the deliberations of the State of the World Forum, which was something formed by Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, along with Senator Alan Cranston, where they brought together, I don't know, about 1,000 of the world's leaders in all different fields to say, look, the world's changed, the Cold War is over, let's get the best scientists, best poets, best visionaries, best politicians, best military people together and talk about what are the existential problems the world is facing. And in those deliberations, Presidents Gorbachev and several other notable people, Oscar Arias was there, and really terrific world leaders said, you know, we need to focus on the nuclear issue. It's an existential threat to everybody. Senator Cranston, who had a passion about this from having met Albert Einstein in around 1950, said, you know, let's form a separate organization focused on the elimination of nuclear weapons. So I think it was around 1998 we formed it. And it was really under the motto that Senator Cranston had, which was, nuclear weapons are unworthy of civilization. So our board has great people, great advisors, Jane Goodall, President Arias, Rigoberto Menchu-Tum, President Gorbachev, Frank von Hippel, who was the White House Science and Security Advisor under Bill Clinton, and so we formed a nonprofit organization focused on this theme and developed a series of programs. One program is Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, which is now in over 80 countries. I'm pleased to say that in recent times the new Foreign Minister of Italy was one of our active members. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts is one of our co-presidents. This is a unique enterprise of parliamentarians with a global perspective, not just for their own people who voted them, but to look at the whole world. And we have another program called the Bipartisan Security Group. Our timing wasn't particularly good in Washington because bipartisanship is needed, but it's not really the popular norm right now, but we believe it's necessary, so we're putting that compass point there. And that group is chaired by Ambassador Thomas Graham. Ambassador Thomas Graham led the U.S. negotiations for the extension of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. He was one of the chief negotiators of the START Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Also in the group is Ambassador Robert Gray, who was the Ambassador of the United States to the Conference on Disarmament. And we lost one of the founders, Rose Gutmuller, Ambassador Gutmuller, who's our lead negotiator for the U.S. government on arms control issues, a spectacular, towering figure in international affairs. So we try to bring a global perspective and a bipartisan perspective, because our feeling is this issue really transcends partisanship. And it's a global threat. It's not just a national issue.
Exactly. It certainly is. It affects everybody. All 7.2 billion people on planet Earth should be concerned about nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. You mentioned Albert Einstein a moment ago. As I recall, was he the one who said one time that if we ever had World War III with nuclear weapons, if there were an exchange, and if we survived it, we would fight World War IV with sticks and stones? Was he accurate on that?
We don't even need a full-scale world war to accomplish such destruction. Mm-hmm. He also said that the atomic bomb has changed everything and it has to change our thinking. If about 100 of these horrific devices go off, now let me just step back a second. The bombs that exploded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were no more than 15 kilotons. It's 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Mm-hmm. We know what they did. They leveled these cities. But those are the size of triggering devices in the current arsenals we have. We have bombs in the megaton range now. A megaton is 1 million tons of TNT. So we're talking about 70 Hiroshimas in 1 megaton bomb. Mm-hmm. That destructive capacity simply boggles the human imagination. There have been recent studies done that the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War have made very public. They won a Nobel Peace Prize for their work in this subject. That evidence that if about 100 went off, that the stratosphere would have so much soot in it that the temperature on the planet as a whole would go down 1 degree to 1.5 degrees Celsius for at least a decade. Well, that would cause massive famines, 2-3 billion people starving to death. It would destroy this wonderful web of human relationships that we call civilization very rapidly. So there are about 17,000 nuclear weapons, and all we need is about 100. So if there was a exchange, not even a full-scale exchange of the arsenals of India and Pakistan, everybody here in New York would be dramatically affected. The whole world is subject to the weakest link in the chain. So a full world war that Einstein was talking about is not necessary with these devices to end civilization.
Exactly. And it's frightening at times. You hear some members of Congress, not too many, but a few, saying, well, we could have a limited nuclear exchange. That's absolutely impossible. You can't have a limited nuclear exchange because who knows where to stop. And you mentioned the horrific firepower that would absolutely create this nuclear winter, which would decimate people. But let's talk. I think you mentioned there are about 17,000. We think about 17,000 nuclear weapons on planet Earth. How many nuclear powers or how many countries have nuclear weapons at this point?
9.
9 of them.
There are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Mm-hmm. Those 5 have promised under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty to negotiate the elimination of their nuclear weapons. Those countries are the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, and France. In exchange for that promise, all other countries in the world have promised not to develop nuclear arsenals, except India, Pakistan, and Israel never signed the treaty. Mm-hmm. India said, we won't because the treaty's unequal. It must universally eliminate nuclear weapons. We will sign such a treaty that eliminates them universally. Pakistan says we'll mirror India. Israel says we're under extreme threat. North Korea was in the treaty and dropped out. So those are the 9 countries. And thus, it is a controllable problem. We know who has them, we know where they are, and we could get rid of them. Failure is political will, not technical complexity.
Are we moving? You referenced, I think, Articles 4 and 6 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, where the nuclear powers are going to start reducing their nuclear stockpiles. The countries that don't have them are going to utilize nuclear energy for peaceful uses. Are we moving in that direction, or have we had a setback? And if so, what is that setback?
Let me unpack what you just referred to a little.
Okay.
I mean,
please.
The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty arose shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the KGB and the CIA looked at the situation. They knew how close we came to ending the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they concluded, without a treaty constraining proliferation, by the mid-1970s, they expected dozens of nuclear weapon states. Clearly a hazard beyond control. So they began negotiations for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which entered into force while Richard Nixon was President of the United States in 1970. And it is a core bargain in which these 5 states that had tested nuclear weapons by January of 1967, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, promised the rest of the world, if you don't get nuclear weapons, we will negotiate our nuclear weapons away. We will eliminate them. So we now have the rest of the world saying, yes, we will restrain ourselves, but we want something in return. We want a promise that we will have the peaceful uses of nuclear technology. This was before Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and a sensitivity to the dangers of nuclear energy. Nevertheless, that's the treaty's terms. You get nuclear technology if you don't get nuclear weapons, and we stop proliferation for the promise to negotiate their elimination. So that's the balance of the treaty, and I would say that this is the 3rd most important legal instrument of the 20th century. The most important legal instrument is the United Nations Charter of the 20th century. I would say of the 18th century, it's probably the United States Constitution, which puts power in the hands of the people. That's fabulous. Now, in the 20th century, in the shadow of World War II, countries of the world said, we better talk to each other instead of kill each other. It's a lot better. And then the other treaty that's really important, of course, is the Declaration of Human Rights, which sets a standard of what is it to be human, how should we treat each other. It raises the inherent dignity of the individual person and says that's even more important than anything else in our value system as a global community. And the 3rd is the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which isn't as easily understandable and accessible as the other 2, but our survival, to some extent, is dependent on fulfilling its promise for nuclear disarmament.
And our viewers can go to your website, gsinstitute.org, and get more information about what we're talking about and some of the items we may not get to today. But you're absolutely correct about the UN Charter. And of course, that was in 1945. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights came through the General Assembly in 1948. And of course, then we have the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. You mentioned the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Those are all major documents, and we do need to learn more about them. We need to sit down and read them, and they can certainly do that by Googling. Our viewers can do that by Googling them, or go to un.org, or go to your website, or a variety of other sources. Where are we today? We hear about nuclear weapons, but usually it's only in the context of trying to keep Iran from going nuclear, or it's to try to get the North Koreans to reduce what we think is their nuclear stockpile. I hear all kinds of figures, but a rough estimate of maybe 10 or something like that, to try to get them to ratchet down. But where is this whole discussion on nuclear weapons? How come we don't read more about it, see more about it? How come it's not covered more? Because this could eliminate all living organisms on planet Earth, and it could be done, as you mentioned, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were at code red. We were one button away from basically eliminating the majority of the people and all living organisms on planet Earth. But why don't we read more about this?
I don't think it's a very pleasant subject. I don't think that our media is being responsible in failing to highlight the commitments that nations have made on this subject. I don't think that it draws viewers. It is something that we'd rather not think about. I'd rather not think about it, but I feel an obligation to because I know about it. It's a really interesting question. There was a great psychologist at Yale University, Robert Lifton, one of the experts on the Holocaust and genocide, who called it psychic numbing. And because we're capable of dealing with a certain level of tragedy psychologically, biologically as people. At a certain level we can imagine it. But when it gets to nuclear weapons, it's unimaginable. It's like going back to the beginning of Genesis. It's obliterating all the future, everything we hold dear. And when you look at it carefully, you say, my goodness, what has happened? Well, there have been many, many instances, dozens, in which we've come inches, not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, computer errors that have looked like there have been full-scale launches against the Soviet Union. In 1995, there was a weather satellite launched off of Norway that Boris Yeltsin had 8 minutes to decide whether that was a Trident launch or something else, which wasn't really enough time for a rational decision, and yet the whole world hung in the fate of the decision of one man who had serious problems, personal problems in his life. This kind of existential threat hanging all over all of us. Very difficult to live with that if you think of it on a daily basis. And once you really look at it, you have to think about it, because it does threaten us every day. People don't realize that the weapons between Russia and the United States are still on alert as they were at the height of the Cold War.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at this whole issue of nuclear proliferation, and my guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Jonathan Granoff. Mr. Granoff is the current president of the Global Security Institute. Jonathan, we've been talking about nuclear weapons, and we see that even today, even though maybe there's been some reductions in certain areas by some of the folks who have them, but we still see that they're land-based. We see them on ships. We see them in planes and that type of thing. It is, just looking at the United States alone, it's costing, as I understand it, excuse me, over $100 million a day to monitor or to maintain this system. It seems to me, I mean, obviously nobody's going to unilaterally disarm, but by the same token, it seems that this is a very expensive proposition to try to maintain these nuclear weapons. Would it not be in our best interest to really engage fully and set up a safeguard system as best we can to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, to reduce the, as you mentioned, the possibility of an accidental attack or what people may perceive as an accidental attack, and to use that money in other areas, because there are so many other crying needs, infrastructure development, education, health, just on across the board, but $100 million a day. And that's just for the U.S. That doesn't count the other 8 nuclear powers. So how do we move in that direction?
Well, obviously, schools, hospitals, things that directly affect the quality of our lives is a better investment than these weapons. But if you accept the premise that security is the precondition for development, for a healthy society, and then you accept the premise that nuclear weapons help bring security, then the cost is minimal. The cost is small. The cost is worth paying. The premise that's wrong is that nuclear weapons bring security. Nuclear weapons are a paradox. The more they're perfected, the less security we obtain. We are squaring off with countries that we're doing trade with. We're squaring off in a world in which globalization is normal. My suit was made in Canada. My shoes were made in Spain. I bought my gasoline from a Russian concession. My computer was on the blink. I was on the phone with a lady from Bangalore. The money was borrowed from China. We live in a global world, and yet we're still squaring off as if we were existential enemies. I believe that not only is it a total squandering of intellectual capacity and cash, but there are real problems that require our cooperation, that we have to work together to protect the climate. We have to work together to protect the oceans. 70% of our fishing stocks in the oceans are at risk. We're polluting our oceans because we're not cooperating. We're cutting down rainforests faster than they can replenish themselves. Those are the lungs of the planet. To deal with those issues, to deal with pandemic diseases which don't carry passports, to deal with cybersecurity, anti-terrorism, we need cooperation. How can countries fully cooperate when they're squaring off with nuclear weapons? So that, to me, is even more serious than the cash that we're wasting. And then, of course, there's the moral issue. What right does this generation have to place the entire future of humanity at risk? And the other moral dimension is, what right does a handful of countries have to say, these are valuable for us, and they're not valuable for you? How can I, if I'm smoking a cigar, tell somebody else not to smoke a cigarette? It's not a practical, sustainable, or moral order that we're having. And it's not, because of that, it's going to change. We're either going to have a cascade of proliferation at some point, because it's unequal, it's not coherent, or we must move toward disarmament. That's why people like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry, and Sam Nunn, not particularly associated with the kind of, with anything other than harsh realpolitik have come out in the Wall Street Journal and said time and again, for nonproliferation to be successful, the commitment to disarmament must be credible. And the only way it can be credible is by action, by fulfilling promises that have been made. The countries with nuclear weapons have made promises, and they have to keep them. Otherwise, the hazard is far too great.
Well, there was a bipartisan effort there. that's commendable. You're also, I didn't mention this earlier, but you're a special advisor to the Nobel Peace Laureate Summit. What exactly is that summit, and how do you bring that into this discussion of nuclear proliferation?
Well, I've had the privilege of representing the International Peace Bureau, a Nobel Peace Laureate organization there, and I'm also part of the Secretariat staff. And you don't have to bring it to the table there. You have a number of Nobel Peace Laureates and laureate organizations that are deeply committed to the issue. Amongst the Nobel Peace Laureates, profoundly committed to the issue is Mohamed El-Baradei, Mikhail Gorbachev, Oscar Arias, Jose Horta, Lech Walesa, then the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, not to mention Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the United Nations itself, which has a Secretary General who's called for a nuclear weapons convention. So there's very little effort. What I've noticed is that they are brilliant world leaders, and each year they have a summit and they get together. Last year it was in Warsaw, Poland, and the theme in human solidarity. Next year it'll be in Cape Town, and then the next year in 2015 it will come and be in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, what they do is they bring more of a holistic perspective to it. So you have Nobel Peace Laureates who've addressed the climate. And so they bring to the table, well, we need to cooperate on the climate. And then we have the Nobel Peace Laureates who focus on nuclear disarmament say, well, these issues are conjoined. Our political leaders have to see these things as holistic, as global threats, as unique to our time. And what's interesting is you have these people who put their lives on the line and succeeded in dramatic social change. All of them, each year, if you go to the Nobel Peace Laureate Summit's website and look at the statements they've made, each year they make a statement calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Sometimes it's a broad moral statement, and sometimes they get into particular policies that will help get us there. Entry into force of the Test Ban Treaty, a treaty banning the production of any more nuclear fissile materials. But mainly, it is the moral compass point that the Nobel Peace Laureates as a whole consistently make. And they are the highest moral secular voices that we have. And consistently, every year since about 2002, I think, they've said, we must work together to eliminate nuclear weapons. We should listen to them.
We certainly should. Since back in the 80s, I guess it was, we've been talking about this missile defense shield.
Yes.
And it comes and it goes. It's at times it's on the drawing board. It's a very expensive proposition, but how much would something like that cost? And even better, would it work?
Well, how much would it cost? That's impossible. It depends what you want it to do. I mean, if you want to have the impermeable shield, like guard all over the United States or over Europe or over God knows. I mean, first of all, if you have it over some, why shouldn't we have it over all? But second of all, it's never been tested with actual spoofing devices, balloons, things like that. But my concern is that if it should work, if it did work, and a country had it, they would have a sword, and if they had nuclear weapons, they'd have the sword and the shield. And if another country didn't have both the shield and the sword, you'd have instability. And instability is the most dangerous thing. So that if one country has it, then all of the others need to have it to have stability. Well, why bother? We should have a control regime so we don't need to have this. Thus far, the system has never really been tested in the way that it's been sold. Now, there's some kinds of theater missile defense systems that might work, but that's different than the way it's sold to the American people, that we'll put some kind of shield and we'll be protected from these devices. Let's just say, for example, let's say you had one that was 90% effective. That and almost nothing. I mean, what kind of device is 90%?
Exactly.
And we couldn't get the health.
What's
we couldn't get
100%?
the computers for the
That's
American
right.
healthcare system. Anybody who has a computer, who has any device, knows that they have defects. So if it's not 100%, so another country, they wanted to say lob 100. They only needed to lob 100 missiles in, so they put multiple independent reentry vehicles on the missile, more warheads on the missile. They just increased their arsenal to overcome it. So instead of having 100 come in, they only need 10 to come in to accomplish the same goal. It's irrational, it's dangerous, it's expensive, and we should stop it.
Exactly. And the point being that even if 10% of the missiles came through, it would still be enough to wipe out a large part of the human race and all living organisms. But Jonathan Granoff, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. This is Bill Miller. I want to thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.